You can get started whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Kara. So I will go ahead and call the MAG Transit Committee meeting to order. Kara, we want to start with roll call?
Of course. All right, so I'm going to start right at the top here. We have Sarah Allred for Jill.
Present.
Thank you. Christabel Dykstra. Okay. Sean Banda.
Present.
Thank you. Jose Macias.
Present.
Thank you. Benjamin Bitter.
Here.
Got you. Don Coomer. I think I see you, Don, but I don't hear you.
Sorry, Kara, I was muted. This is Dawn. I'm here.
No problem. I just want to make sure you can speak for voting purposes. Thank you, Dawn. Nathan Williams. Kevin Link.
Here.
I've got you. Thanks. Christine McMurdy.
Here.
Thank you. Judy Ramos. I believe she left Maricopa and they're still working on finding her replacement. Reed Kempton.
I'm here.
Thank you. Jody Sorrell. I think I see you, Jody. I don't hear you. Okay. Miss Colbath, Kathy Colbath.
I'm here.
Thanks, Kathy. Jesus Sapien.
Here.
Got you. Tara Harmon. All right. Heather Wilkie.
Present.
Thank you. Salvatore LaPuma. Ratna Corpella.
Here.
Thank you. Kristen Taylor. Eric Iverson.
Here.
Thank you. Gabe Elias. Carol Ketcherside.
I'm here.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol. Grant Anderson. Jer Crampton. I think you're here. I saw you.
I'm here still.
Sorry. I'll just go through once more to make sure I didn't miss anyone. I didn't hear from Christabel, Nathan,
I'm here.
Kara. Nathan, there you are. Yeah. I got you.
Christabel's here with Avondale.
Thank you. Keep going down the list. Tara, Salvatore, Kristen Taylor, Gabe Elias, Grant Anderson. Last call.
Hey, Kara, I got a text from Kristen Taylor. She's trying to get the meeting on her computer, but her computer decided it was better to go ahead and load updates instead of attend the meeting. So she's trying, but she'll just keep an eye. She might join us like midstream.
Thank you for that update, Miss McMurdy. I appreciate it. And we're good. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you, Kara. So now we'll move on to agenda item number 2. Before we do that, I just wanted to remind everybody to unmute yourself when speaking and mute yourself at all other times. So item number 2 is the approval of February 1, 2021 Transit Committee meeting minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the minutes? Okay, hearing none, if I could get a motion for approval.
Mr. Chair, this is Jesus. I move approval.
Thank you, Jesus. Can we get a second?
Christine McMurdy, second.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, Kara, would you like to take a vote?
Absolutely. So we're starting right back at the top. Miss Allred, how do you vote?
Yes.
Miss Dykstra,
Yes.
thank you. Mr. Banda, I can't hear you. If you might be muted. Last call, Mr. Banda. I can't hear you. Sorry. All right, moving on. Mr. Bitter,
Aye.
Mr. Macias.
Aye.
Thank you. Miss Coomer,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Yes.
Mr. Link,
Aye.
Miss McMurdy,
Yes.
Mr. Kempton,
Aye.
Miss Sorrell.
Aye.
Thanks. Miss Colbath,
Aye.
Mr. Sapien,
Aye.
Miss Harmon, Miss Wilkie,
Aye.
Mr. LaPuma, Miss Corapella,
Aye.
Mr. Iverson,
Aye.
Miss Ketcherside,
Aye.
and Chair Crampton.
Aye.
All right, the motion passes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Moving on to number 3, call to the audience. Members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting through the MAG website. Comments may be sent at any time leading up to the meeting, but must be received at least 1 hour prior to the posted start time for the meeting. Kara, have we received any public comments?
Chair Crampton, we have not received any comments for this item or any of the other items on the agenda today.
Okay, thank you. Now on to item number 4, Transportation Planning Program Manager's Report. Audra Kester-Thomas will be providing the report. Audra.
Thank you, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee. Pleased to be with you here this afternoon. Just a quick few items for you. We are in the planning stages of our annual joint meeting with MAG's Active Transportation Committee, currently planning on that meeting to occur in June. Both Kara and Jason Stevens are working together to come up with a draft agenda for it. Also want to welcome Christabel Dykstra from the City of Avondale to the Transit Committee. Heard her voice early today as she was welcomed to the committee in roll call. Pleased to have you, Christabel, here with us at Transit Committee. And then finally, just one item, we recognize that there is a lot of moving parts and activity associated with varying appropriations or potential administration proposals for future transportation funding. Just an acknowledgement that MAG continues to monitor both federal and state activity. Still lots in development and details yet to come. If you do have questions, please circle them through your InterGov representatives and back to Nathan or myself. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Chair Crampton, that completes my report. Happy to answer any questions after the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Audra. So yes, please see Audra after the meeting if you have any questions. Now we'll move on to item number 5, the draft fiscal year 2021 program of projects and working draft fiscal year 2022 program of projects. So Steph Stearns will be presenting this item, and this item is for action. So Steph, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Crampton, members of the Transit Committee. Pleased to be here this afternoon. Like Chair Crampton noted, this is for action. Next slide, please. The Program of Projects, or POP, is a federal requirement. It's a listing of transit projects for a given fiscal year that is then reconciled with actual federal apportionments. In this case, this is 2021 with a draft of 2022. And the POP is programmed according to priorities that are outlined in the regional programming guidelines for federal transit formula funds. Next slide, please. An overview of the POP. MAG, Phoenix, and Valley Metro begin POP development in the wintertime. Early spring, FTA releases annual apportionments. MAG, Phoenix, and Valley Metro then reconcile the POP with these apportionments. And then later in the spring into early summer, MAG and Phoenix do some concurrent approval cycles by the MAG Regional Council, Phoenix City Council. And all of that then leads to grants being submitted to FTA. Next slide, please. Shown here on the screen are the FTA annual apportionments for our region in 2021. I would like to note that we are fully programmed in all of the funding buckets with the exception of 5310 and STBGP. 5310, there is a concurrent programming process at the MAG Elderly and Disabled Persons Transportation Committee. So we'll get the projects once that committee acts later this month. And for STBGP, we are just waiting on our actual award letter from ADOT. It's always easier to amend the TIP once than it is to do it twice. So once we get that actual apportionment, we'll program exactly to it. Next slide, please. I will take just a quick moment to orient you to what you're seeing on the screen. Each slide represents a funding bucket. In this case, it is the urbanized area formula, FTA 5307. The TIP funding reference is how you can notate or find the project in the TIP. In this case, for 5307 funds, we receive an apportionment for the Avondale Goodyear UZA, as well as the Phoenix Mesa UZA. The next two columns are the actual numbers for 2021. These are apportionments. And then for 2022, we show our projected apportionment or estimate. The examples of programmed projects are just that. They're examples. It's not meant to be a comprehensive or complete list. So for 5307 this year, our main projects include transit security, operating assistance, replacement and expansion vehicles, preventive maintenance, and some other larger projects such as the fare collection system. Next slide, please. 5310, like I mentioned, this programming is ongoing, but the typical projects that we can see are mobility management, ramps and lifts for vehicles, as well as acquisition of transit service. Next slide, please. The FTA State of Good Repair Program, also known as 5337, provides 3 different apportionments to the region. The program projects for this bucket include preventive maintenance, replacement vehicles, and a light rail vehicle communication system upgrade. Next slide, please. For our final FTA apportionment, this is the bus and bus facilities, section 5339, where we are buying both replacement and expansion vehicles. Next slide. Finally, on to the Capital Investment Grant Program, also known as 5309. This funding is awarded nationwide and competitively. Right now, the region is currently receiving funding for the South Central Extension, the Northwest Phase 2 Extension, as well as some funding to expand the Operations and Maintenance Center to accommodate for all this expanded service. Next slide, please. Annually, we transfer some money from the highway side of the house to the transit side of the house. Both CMAQ and STBGP funds are transferred. And our program projects include the Gilbert Road Extension, OMC expansion, light rail and van pool vehicles, as well as preventive maintenance. Next slide, please. We do also have some prior year funds. And by prior year, that just means anything pre-2021. It is not required to show these in the POP, but we just wanted to be transparent and show that We are also applying for projects such as the Buckeye Park and Ride. This was awarded through a competitive process at ADOT, and we were just given some old money. I believe it was 2019. Other projects such as the Levine Park and Ride were not refined to enough detail to put them in a grant, but now that we have all this information, we will be submitting the grants. Next slide, please. The next steps that we can expect today after Transit Committee is the May TRC, followed by June Management Committee and Regional Council, and then an ultimate FTA grant submittal. Next slide, please. Chair Crampton and members of the committee, that concludes my presentation. The action requested of you is on the screen, but I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steph. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Okay, if not, can I get a motion for approval?
Kevin Link, so moved, Mr. Chair.
Okay, motion from Kevin Link, and can I get somebody to second?
I'll do that. This is Kristen from Surprise.
Kristen with a second. Okay, thank you. And Kara, would you like to take the vote?
Of course, I saw a couple people come in, so I think I've got everyone, but let me know if I miss anyone. So Ms. Allred, how do you vote?
Yes, I concur.
Thanks. Ms. Dykstra,
Yes.
Mr. Macias,
Yes.
Mr. Bitter,
Aye.
Ms. Coomer,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Link,
Aye.
Ms. McMurdy,
Aye.
Mr. Kempton, Mr. Kempton, I don't hear you in case you're muted.
Aye.
Thanks. Ms. Sorrell?
Aye.
Ms. Colbath?
Aye.
Mr. Sapien?
Aye.
Ms. Wilkie?
Aye.
Ms. Corapella?
Aye.
Ms. Taylor?
Aye.
Mr. Iverson?
Aye.
Ms. Countryside?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Chair Crampton?
Aye.
And anyone I missed?
Hey, Kara, this is Sean, City of Buckeye. Aye.
Thank you. All right, and the motion passed unanimously. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll move on to item number 6, which is the update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. So Audra Kester-Thomas will be providing the presentation. Thank you, Audra.
Thank you, Chair Crampton. Pleased to be with you today. We're going to focus on bus transit items. We've pulled this through our committee process now over a month ago, and this direction has informed our development of scenarios. So today I'll talk a little bit about some of those fundamental bus transit assumptions moving in through scenario planning, and then talk also about what's going to happen this spring. We're really at the crescendo of our RTP development process. There'll be a lot going on. Look forward to your partnership as we drive towards a consensus plan. Next slide. So we're going to focus on a recent conversation we had with our management committee work group that also then just came through our full committee process, focused on bus transit. This really picks up from and builds from conversations we initiated last fall. Again, we're going to be focused on the bus transit component, recognizing certainly high capacity transit will play a role in our future development. Largely on the capital side, we are carrying forward based on policymakers' direction, the Prop 400 assumption that rail operations will still be carried wholly by local agencies. Next slide. So we look at the varying components of bus transit. There's several of them, much more complex than capital investment programs where we're identifying just capital infrastructure investments. As you all know, it's not just the capital component that enables transit within the region. The harder part really is coming up with the operations funding. We're going to focus today's presentation on these three main areas. We're going to talk a little bit about the assumptions associated with bus capital, both in the Prop 400 program and what we're proposing moving forward. We're going to talk about some regional services, and then we're going to end our conversation on a big topic of conversation, which is operating assistance for enabled regional transit. Next slide. First, starting with bus capital, I'll orient you. These slides focus on our current policy coming out of Proposition 400 and then MAG's recommendation to our policymakers on a potential future policy. As noted, this was all carried through our policy committee process last month and is instrumental in the scenarios we have currently developed and will be presenting at the end of this month. First, starting with bus replacement, as you are all very well aware, this is one of the areas that the region picks up a significant amount of investment. Currently, the region picks up the cost of the fleet using 80% federal funding of 5307 variety and then using our sales tax for the local match of 20%. Because of the importance in fleet to enabling transit investments here in the region, we are recommending that this policy continue. Transit asset management, as part of Proposition 400, there wasn't a formal protocol or policy established, and from this point forward really has been an ad hoc approach. We're recommending leveraging our current partnerships for transit asset management with our operators, notably City of Phoenix and Valley Metro, and transitioning to a more long-range approach, setting aside funding for these ongoing investments, recognizing that they're not just one-term or one-time costs, and going to a life cycle approach. We do have to bring through our bus transit asset management assumptions. Not only is that a federal requirement, but we're required to tie that to our RTP. We're just leveraging this moving forward to do a more long-range approach. Preventative maintenance. Currently, we allocate, as indicated in the previous presentation and included in our funding guidelines, 25% of our 5307 funding to PM or preventative maintenance. This has the effect of lowering service costs to those of you who purchase it. We're recommending maintaining this policy. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that from a grant management perspective for our designated recipient, City of Phoenix, putting a lot of or focusing our 5307 funds in PM has by way of benefit, grant management benefits. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. And then finally, park and rides, transit centers. These were identified, some of these were identified in Proposition 400. We're actually recommending setting aside funding for these and transitioning to an iterative commuter-based planning effort. We have funding set aside for these, but leveraging the opportunity in the future as we develop commuter-based planning transit investments, also using the opportunity to potentially locate transit centers, but more importantly, park and rides adjacent with our freeway investments, leveraging the DHOVs or HOV network that so enables our commuter investment. Next slide. Regional services now. Talk about two of them in particular, commuter bus. As you all know, commuter bus funding for Express now comes out of our distinct allocations from our member agencies. We're recommending, because of the regional nature of this service, to set aside funding for commuter bus because of its regional investment, crossing multiple jurisdictions, many times over many dead service miles, since we do have distinct origin and destination patterns, but also transitioning to an ongoing planning opportunity. While all those buses now currently end in the City of Phoenix, downtown Phoenix, we imagine as this region continues to urbanize, different activity centers may emerge, that different origin destination patterns may also emerge. And so we want to make sure we have the flexibility to change based on those differences in commute patterns. Next slide. ADA, this is probably one of the most discussed components, especially with our city managers. This will surprise none of you. Proposition 400 did include funding to support ADA and paratransit. We're recommending that the region continues to support ADA paratransit investments, but with that, driving towards a universal region-wide definition that adheres to the federal minimum. I think what we heard loud and clear from our managers is cost containment, and I think we agree. We want to endeavor towards an approach whereby not only do we have a consistent application service that is expected across the region, but that we're really driving to incentivize cost-effective solutions to what can be extremely expensive service in the region. Next slide. Now moving to transit operating assistance. As we discussed last fall and began discussing it, currently the small percentage of funds that are allocated to enabling supergrid service as part of Proposition 400 was initially planned as a long-range plan in 2003, but then by way of policy at Valley Metro, established a fixed allocation, a revenue sharing model, if you will, with member agencies. That fixed allocation, known as jurisdictional equity, is then utilized to inform transit operating decisions. We are continuing to work through this process, but MAG's recommendation has been to move towards a more formula-based approach where we are tying service outcomes with the scarce dollars that we have available for transit, and that we would work to allocate and identify what that proportional sharing of funding would be on an annual or biannual basis. Another point that our managers told us was wanting to make sure that we are aligning that calendar with your local budgets. Unique to this region, as we have discussed before, is the role local funding plays in enabling transit operations. That's going to continue no matter what a regional investment looks like. We will continue to rely heavily on local investments, and we want to make sure this timeline works, of course, for your city management. All right, it looks like we'll need to go back a couple slides here. One more. Okay, now advance it. Thank you. So there's many opportunities when you look at industry practice. Typically, vehicles, revenue miles, and passengers or a proxy for ridership are used. That's industry standard across the nation. We'd recommend these two variables move forward. But the conversations that our managers have also acknowledged is that there's sometimes there are things that there are regional desires that may not come down to those two qualifiers. Access, particularly to vulnerable populations, recognizing that we have transit dependent populations, I think was something that was highlighted by our managers. We're right now working with our consultants to further flesh out what this might look like. So member agencies, as we go through our scenario planning process, can understand how we might pivot to a more formula-based approach. Next slide. City of Phoenix certainly can have to acknowledge their tremendous amount of local investment to enable transit today. They are our legacy transit provider. In ongoing discussions with the City of Phoenix, they would want to continue to run their current rapid service within the City of Phoenix. We also discussed that City of Phoenix would continue their allocation for bus operations coming out of Proposition 400, as well as support for ADA, paratransit, that would be reimbursed as it is today as well. Next slide. So how would this calculation concept be approached? We recommended to our policymakers that we would continue the baseline allocation coming out of Proposition 400. We heard loud and clear from managers last fall and then through this past winter that those legacy routes or legacy investment needs to be the floor for a regional investment. And so we're recommending that those allocations continue, in fact, as a floor for bus service support. Then any additional funding above and beyond that ongoing commitment, if you will, would be allocated based on this formula. Again, tying service outputs to the funding support available. We would work with you, our member agencies, to identify just how we would address that allocation cycle, maybe annually, maybe every 2 years, but certainly making sure it's aligned with your own internal budget processes. But we also recognize too the current status of our region's transit system. Quite frankly, we're still young in developing a transit network here in this region. We recognize our fast-paced growth will continue, and there may be new and emerging markets over the course of the next 10, 20, 30 years from now. So MAG is recommending also setting aside some funding to test out, be partners with member agencies to see whether or not there is sufficient transit demand when and if we decide to expand the current footprint of transit service that is out in our region. We'd want to work to develop a protocol for how that would occur, but ultimately invest alongside our member agencies in testing the potential for a transit market in those emerging areas. Next slide. So we do still have several things that we need to work out as we release our draft scenarios here at the end of the month. Those are now going to be fiscally constrained. We'll work with our managers and policymakers to further refine some of these basic concepts as they relate to our service funding options. A lot of details still to figure out, but quite frankly, many years of work still ahead of us as we look to the extension. Even after a potential successful ballot, we'll have a lot of work to do before 2026 arrives and the funding becomes available to the region. So just want to acknowledge that we're still a work in progress, no doubt, bringing more information back to our policymakers. And just a note, at the end of this month, our next management committee work group meeting will feature those draft scenarios, scenarios that are with a 1/2 cent assumption, a continuation of our 1/2 cent sales tax, but also scenarios that demonstrate what we could potentially deliver if we increase our investment up to 1 cent. And so that will be our featured focus this month, working really fast and furious with our modeling team at MAG to pull that information together to present. Next slide. So when you look ahead, here we are really in the heart of our spring, developing our potential scenarios. Again, it's a starting point. None of them are perfect and not intended to be. What they are intended to do is demonstrate what we can and cannot deliver within a fixed budget and use our policymakers' feedback to drive towards a preferred alternative. We hope to do that by this summer so we can move into our air quality conformity process, develop the final and formal plan for potential consideration of our elected officials by the end of this year. If successful, that jumps us right into our enabling legislation in 2022, whereby successful work at the legislature would enable the opportunity to go to the voters next November 2022. I believe this is my last slide, and Chairman Crampton, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Audra. Your presentations are certainly in high demand, so we appreciate the time today. This is wonderful information that I'm sure we're all appreciating. So questions, I see Jesus has some questions in the chat, so I'll turn it to you first, Jesus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to acknowledge all of the work that MAG staff has been doing on this. I know that they have to present to many a group at varying levels, and they've been, doing the yeoman's work of figuring out what we can do under current constraints and potential for future. And the way they deliver the message is very clear and understandable. So Audra and the team, thank you so much. The couple questions I have, and I'm going to go to I have the presentation on my computer, so I'm going to go by slide number. Slide number 3, regional bus funding program components. I would just throw out there that transit asset management is not just a bus capital item, that touches anything that we own, because that's, going to be federally funded. So, transit center, park and ride, bus stop, whatever, it's just not going to be bus capital.
You bet.
And then I entered a question, which I think Steph confirmed, that we're buying buses at an 85/15 split, not an 80/20 as the presentation showed. Is that correct?
I'll have to go back and look at, excuse me, at that, Jesus.
Okay. And then on Phoenix's rapid commitment, just wanted to clarify that. And let me see, that is slide 9. That the operations aren't PTF funded, but we do want buses funded with,
Absolutely.
Federal and PTF, and that just want to make sure everyone knows that. Can you explain again that middle box, what's meant by COP allocated by formula based?
Go back one slide, Jeremy. There we go. So right now, assuming there is a half cent for, particularly in our half cent scenarios, assumption that in discussions with City of Phoenix, ongoing conversations with City of Phoenix, that the existing floor of an allocation coming out of Proposition 400 would carry forward, that no additional funding for bus operations would be set aside for the City of Phoenix, and more likely to see an investment on light rail or a capital focused on the rail program. If a significant amount of investment were to be pushed into transit, if we went above a half cent, for example, our policymakers endorsed going up to maybe even a full penny, we would have to reevaluate our allocations to ensure that City of Phoenix has a proportional investment that makes the most sense. But we're going to wait for our policymakers to direct us on the proportional funding allocations. Just want to acknowledge that at this point, that floor of bus allocation funding would stay static coming out of Proposition 400.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Okay, thank you, Jesus. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I think Nathan had a question. Oh, no, he says never mind. He had a question on definition for service or actual transit output levels, but sounds like his question's answered. Nathan, if you have anything further, please speak up or enter more chat. Otherwise,
yeah. No, hey, thanks, Jason. It's Nate. The next slide kind of answered that question. Although, as I look at the timeline for it, we're kind of already in the middle of that scenarios and trade-offs analysis. So I'm just curious, when will we have a more firm idea of when, what constitutes those actual potential transit output levels that, would go into that formula-based approach?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee, Nathan. Yeah, so our plan is to present the draft scenarios to our Management Committee work group at the end of this month. Contained therein will be the amount of set aside for bus operations. It differs based on the scenario, of course, and certainly by funding allocation. Half cent scenarios, as we've discussed before, are really tight to be able to deliver a budgeted amount. We're able to potentially expand transit investments if that funding amount is also increased. So we'll present those at the end of this month, take that through the committee process, bring that back through. There's a lot of moving parts. It's not just transit operations, of course, but we have a myriad of capital projects as well. In addition to other funded programs that we would be recommending, not only our current funded programs, such as ITS or safety, active transportation as an example, but we'll be presenting concepts for new programs. Notable probably from our policymakers' perspective is in emerging technology, transportation innovation, setting aside potential funding for those things that we don't yet know, but imagine will occur over the lifespan of our tax. So over the next month or two, things will become, a lot of information will be out on the streets. We'll be back. We'll meet with anybody anytime they would like to go over these details. But the focus really over the course of the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks will be on discerning direction from our policymakers, notably on sales tax rate, what they feel comfortable with, and then the composition of the high capacity projects and funded program amounts accordingly.
Okay, thank you. And Kathy Colbeth has a question. Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a generic question looking forward as we potentially look at changing some of the ways that we allocate funding. Going back to the formula calculation, Audrey, you mentioned that if we see emerging transit markets and needs, that's something we'll take a look at. I'm just wondering, as we go through this process, how we're going to be determining what that is. If it's a development that occurs as far as a high employment location, or is it, just the number of people wanting to ride? Because we know that people will make their life decisions based on what transit is available currently versus, making a decision to move out and still want to use transit if there's nothing available. So I know there's no answer now, just taking those scenarios into consideration as we move forward in this process.
Yeah, no, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee, Kathy, great point. And I think that's one of the reasons why, we recommended not doing what we did in Prop 400, which is set out a 25-year plan for where bus service would occur, knowing things change so quickly. It's not what our peers do. I think our focus right now is setting aside funding, getting our policymakers decisions on what feels like the right proportionality of investment. But then actually over the course of the next couple of years, architecting, if you will, a process by which we would make those policy level determinations, not just on a year over year service allocation, but then imagining how we could set aside and implement that, if you will, test bucket of emerging transit. I think we recognize new markets will and can emerge. Sometimes they look better on paper than they really are, or vice versa. But we see the opportunity to leverage funding in partnership with local communities to test those markets out to see if they would be viable for future expansion. So we don't and will not have all of those answers in the next couple of months or 6 months. But what we want to do is set forth kind of the parameters for the kinds of investments that our policymakers feel comfortable with, and then use, like we did actually for Proposition 400, the next couple of years, creating the policy and framework for which we would actually implement that new transit operating system. So we'll have more questions in the short term, but what we want to do right now is start looking at what that could look like, and how we might be able to leverage different colors of money actually for that, as well as by way of example. CMAQ actually is one of the few federal funding sources that we could leverage to test out potential emerging transit markets, and it provide an opportunity for us to explore that. We want to do better about our allocation of when we use federal funding versus local sales tax funding in this next extension. That's just one example of it. So we will answer some of these questions in the short term. But actually, what we're going to be doing is focusing on a commitment to really build a future transit program in the next couple of years, especially if our policymakers endorse an increase in bus allocation funding.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Audra. Jesus, one more question I see coming in the chat. Go ahead.
Grant was first if he wants to go first. I'm okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Grant. I missed you. Thank you, Jesus. Grant, sorry about that.
Well, I do have a question, kind of an odd one for this time. It seems in the past, and of course I've been around a long time, that we would take the needs through the committees to try to develop the needs and then show the needs to the policymakers before we ask for funding level. Audra, I just heard you say we're going to them first to see what they're comfortable with. Do they have metrics or anything of that nature so they can determine what the need is? Because in the past, we would develop need and then we would put scenarios out with funding levels. And now we're talking to the policymakers, which then ask us, do we really need that? And we don't even know what they're being asked.
Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee Grant. Actually, we did. That's where we started this process with initiation of a call for projects actually to our member agencies.
Right.
What we've been able to demonstrate actually is that we now have, with just the potential items still left in consideration by our policymakers, $90 billion worth of need and approximately $28 billion worth of funding. And so we've actually been presenting that iteratively to our policymakers over the course of the last 6 months. And one of the things that we really wanted to demonstrate is the proportional need of transit relative to the available amount of funding now. One of the reasons we also did that peer region analysis last year was to demonstrate our comparative investment portfolio for transportation compared to other regions. This committee will remember one of the key takeaways was acknowledging that we were copied by our wonderful success back in the 80s and then subsequent renewal of the half-cent sales tax in 2004. But we have been far surpassed by local transportation investment with peers whom we compete for the latest and greatest job development or locations. And so, I think the thing that has resonated with our policymakers is the recognition that our transportation needs continue to grow, especially as our growth pace speeds, and that diminishing revenue sources that we also count on, like the gas tax, like HERF in particular, actually puts more pressure on you from local member agencies' perspectives, but also on the region where we have an imbalance, if you will, between the funding source for a certain kind of investment, in this case, roadway maintenance, an inverse relationship with it and actually its use. And so we've actually started that process way back last year. We've demonstrated the huge gap between needs and available funding, and actually been spending a lot of time also getting constituent feedback on where priorities should be. And what we've heard and continue to hear is a multimodal portfolio is what's needed. And of things that we know, this region trails our partners, our other peer regions in transit investment, which is no surprise when you're contributing 0.17 cents of a regional tax and leveraging local funding to enable a regional system. The bottom line is our policymakers have some really tough choices on their plates, especially if a decision is to retain just a half-cent sales tax.
Audra, I really appreciate the answer, and I do recall our discussion with that. I think what I'm getting sometimes is maybe the policymakers forget that what type of information they have received in order to then be asked a question about dollars, because the dollars they understand. Sometimes the other elements are concerned and they don't relate as well.
Yeah, Chairman Crampton, members of our committee, Grant, great point. I mean, I think that's why we've taken this step at a time. When we came out at the beginning of this year, having processed our roadway projects through a qualitative evaluation to start to separate our highest priorities or areas where the projects are most needed versus ones that maybe there isn't as pressing of a need. The reality is we have a tremendous amount of viable transportation projects that aren't just wants, but they are actually needs. And the reality is just we don't have the funding portfolio for them. We'll be bringing all of that information back. And one of the reasons we're doing our modeling work right now and actually working shift work and over the weekends is so we can help demonstrate that proportionality of investment, Grant. What are the outcomes associated? We're going to be presenting 4 different scenarios at 2 different funding levels. We want to be able to demonstrate what the outcomes of those different investments are as well to our policymakers to help answer some of those key questions, which is it this or that? Where are our highest priorities? Where are we getting the most bang for our buck? Because I think it's germane really to their tough decisions ahead, in addition to the feedback we will seek from the public and stakeholders as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Grant. Thank you, Audra. Okay, Jesus, I think it's your turn now.
Thank you for indulging my second request. So I mentioned this to Audra, I think, Audra, a few months back, I think, and just an idea, because I don't know how it's going to be approached relative to, wants, needs versus resources. One of the things that we did when we were, our city council appointed some of you know, a committee that was called the Committee on the Citizens Committee on the Future of Phoenix Transportation, and they're the ones that helped us put together the T2050 plan that ended up going to voters. So one of the things that we did a exercise with ASU where basically every project, I'll call it, was a puzzle piece, and the size of the piece was commensurate with what we estimated the value to be. And then over several sessions, the committee kind of, put together, this one's in, that one's out, and so on and so forth, and kind of built the core needs of the plan. And we were able to add up the cost of each one of those puzzle pieces and, relate that back to what would that be relative to the amount that went to the voters. Do we stick with a 4/10 cent, half cent? We ended up going with 7/10 cent in Phoenix. But that visually, I think, helped a lot of people understand, if you take out X project, then you're subtracting, and I'm going to make this up, $200 million. And if you do that to a certain extent, then you come down a penny or something like that. And we did that a bunch of times, and it really helped the committee visualize, the size of the total plan, and then equate that to, well, what do we take to the voters? And I don't know if that's, it kind of dovetails with what Grant was saying right now, Audra, but I don't know what the plan is to try to, come up with a final idea of what we end up doing relative to that.
Yeah, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee, Jesus, those exercises where you're able to demonstrate proportionality or size taken up by certain projects or programs is always helpful, right? Because it demonstrates how quickly you can either fill up a space or spend your credit card amount. A little bit more complex, certainly with the region, particularly because we have multiple funding sources. All of our federal funds have strings attached to them, so it can't just be used for anything. And in addition to that, we have member agency contributions, assumptions associated with local match. Ends up being a bit of a Rubik's Cube, if you will, kind of a three-dimensional exercise that little bit more complex than being able just to assign dollars and colors of money for projects. What we are doing is working really hard to start with, how do we tell this story to the public? Because we figure if we're able to successfully garner feedback from the public in some of these tough questions, then we'll be able to explain it to anybody. And I think one of our approaches is we've taken distinct concepts, philosophies, if you will, to developing these scenarios, recognizing there's a way and how that you can deliver certain kinds of projects with a different kind of philosophy. And so we're going to start there and talk about how maybe less sexy projects, but maybe a bit better on your ROI can actually expand your reach and really end up providing better mobility, let's say, across the region. So our job actually is to translate these scenarios to a meaning. What does it really mean? And what we want to drive towards is what feels right. We are waiting on our modeling results as we speak. And so I don't have much of a story yet to tell. But that's going to be critical to be able to communicate, hey, here's what you can get with this package of improvements versus this one. I think we really, really want our policymakers to reflect on the funding amount. Do they feel comfortable with what they can deliver with just a half cent? Does it seem like we're going to have to go over a half cent? Because that is a pivotal point in this conversation. And then we'll drive towards the preferred alternative from that point, taking away things or adding things based on their feedback and dialing in those program sizes accordingly. So a lot of moving parts, but we want to be able to show kind of the bounds. Think of it as a lane on a bowling alley, and we're going to try to provide kind of the context of what we can and cannot do, and then drive towards consensus on high capacity projects and then program funding for our different programs from that point forward. So that's our approach. It looks like Christine might have a question, Chairman.
Okay, yep, Christine, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Audra. So with the scenario planning, how are you going to handle new new types of transit, things like microtransit and flex routes and things like that? How will that be treated? Because I don't think some of our policymakers even know that some of these new models for transit exist.
Yeah, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee, Christine, great question. So we, again, the benefit of doing our big call for projects last year is we were able to see the size and scale, the potential options out there. You know, we ended up getting over 40 different potential programs, a variety, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of potential projects. The reality is we won't be able to deliver them all. So as part of the scenarios, it's important to remember this is what we're presenting is what the region's role, what we would consider the region's role in funding potential investments in the future are. There's a variety of cutting edge potential innovations, both in transit, but other transportation technologies. And it's one of the things that we are cognizant of, and our strategy in providing a little bit more flexibility than we have in the past is taking this programmatic approach where we're setting aside funding today for a specific kind of investment, even if we don't exactly know what it is today. Contradict that to kind of the Proposition 300 and 400 mentality, which was we're at one point in time going to make a list of all the projects we're going to fund over the course of 20 or 25 years, and we're going to stick with that list. While that provides some assurance, certainly, the reality, especially on small projects, is things can change. And we see that today, especially when you go back and look at the 2003 RTP on the transit side of the equation, or even the arterial projects. That lot has changed from that moment in time till today. And so, you know, I think, again, just remember one thing. First of all, this is the articulation of a regional transportation investment, how we're spending both the federal funding that comes through to the region, state funding, as well as the sales tax. But also we're taking in an approach where we'd be setting aside some funding and not making specific project level decisions and using policy guidance on what would be potentially eligible. The reality is there's going to continue to be an evolution, even in the transit world. Jesus has been good about keeping in mind the changes just in commuter bus, a product that was hit hard perhaps from the pandemic. But we want to be mindful that that may evolve or may change into the future. We see it as a viable option moving forward, but our policymakers may make a decision and change that into the future. We want to set up the guidelines for through the MAG process, those changes would occur. So Christine, that's not necessarily a direct answer. There's a lot we still don't know, but our job at MAG is to define how and why we would spend the funding, use our policymakers to make those decisions.
Okay. No, you're right. It wasn't direct, and I realize it's very difficult, maybe impossible to answer the question now. It's just we just want to make sure that, you know, once the first 10, 15, 20 years are done, that there's still life for and potential for future opportunities. So I get it. I appreciate the explanation, Audra. Thanks.
You bet. And as part of the scenarios, we will be detailing all those different assumptions too, so you'll be able to see how the funding portfolio looks.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Audra. Thanks, Christine. And yeah, I'll just kind of piggyback on Christine's questioning and comments. I think microtransit and emerging technologies are certainly critical elements of a future regional transportation network. And I think there's maybe more to it than just adding new transit routes or microtransit routes, but it could be that some of our bus lines evolve into a deviated fixed route or some form of microtransit rather than just looking at new areas for transit. Because I think there are some ways, I know my policymakers are interested in trying to find efficiencies with new technologies any way we can. So I think that's something important to keep in mind as we move this along. So thank you, Audra, for your response. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. I did have one question. Moving back to the ADA discussion, I know this was picked up a lot at the management committee, but I don't know if ride choice in particular was honed in on. So I know if we fund ADA paratransit, but we don't fund ride choice, I worry that could provide an incentive for a lot of communities just to, okay, let's not do ride choice then if we're going to pay that by ourselves. And then you know, that just we talked a lot about the efficiencies of it at the management committee, but I don't know if that point got through. So I just wanted to ask you, is it potential that ride choice could be funded as well? Because I just see it as very problematic if we're funding 100% ADA and not funding ride choice.
Yeah, Chairman Crampton, members of Transit Committee, really good point. I mean, I think what was a little bit lost is, our shared vision to incentivize those cost-effective solutions that may take pressure off of the strict paratransit protocol, for which certainly can be very costly. I think that's still open to conversation. We have a lot still to work out, really, even in that ADA conversation. So I wouldn't say no at all, because I think the endeavor is to make that as cost effective as possible while still meeting the needs and our federal requirements of ADA service.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody else have any further questions or comments before we move on? Okay, I'm not hearing any, so we will go ahead and move on to agenda item 7. Thank you, everybody, for the great discussion and questions. Thank you again, Audra, for the wonderful presentation. So moving on to 7, request for future agenda items. Does anybody out there have any requests for future agenda items? Okay, not hearing any, so we'll move on to number 8, adjournment. So business is concluded. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion
Mr. Chair, go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, motion to adjourn.
Okay, Kathy Jesus, do you want to slide a second?
I'll second it.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.